Hi everyone, welcome back to the Murder Tapes podcast, season 3, episode 6. I spent my weekend at Alamo Drafthouse per usual. If you know me, you know I love going there. And Wilson and I went to go see the new Deadpool and Wolverine film. I loved it, loved the dancing scenes. And we also got invited to a screening for Dee Dee. It was one of the best movies I've seen in a while. It's very nostalgic and the cinematography is amazing. I definitely recommend that you go watch it. Aside from that, I hope you all had a great weekend, and let's get into today's case. I first heard about this case through a news article a while back and instantly knew that I had to cover it. Today we're going to be talking about the Edward Paul Morris case. It was December 19th, 2002, and Edward Paul Morris decided to surprise his family with an unexpected trip to the Tillamook State Forest near the Oregon coast. His family included his 31-year-old pregnant wife, Renee, his 8-year-old daughter Alexis, his 4-year-old son Jonathan, and his 10-year-old son Bryant. He told them that he rented a house on the Oregon coast for the night. They left for the adventure, and after some time, Edward steered the family's gray Dodge minivan onto a logging road, a winding route connecting the Willamette Valley with Tillamook. The kids were asleep in the back of the minivan, and Edward told Renee to close her eyes because he had another surprise for her. He walked to the rear of the minivan, opened the hatch, and grabbed a .22 caliber pistol. He had bought this gun just 2 days earlier from a Portland gun shop. He then put the pistol into his waistband and grabbed a pellet gun. Edward would later say that he considered getting back in the van and driving home, but then laughed and said it would have been ridiculous if he had to explain to his wife that he intended to kill her, but changed his mind. Quote, "I was chickening out, but I didn't give myself any backdoor. I loved Renee so much, I didn't want her to think I was a horrible person." He then walked to the passenger side door where Renee was and told her to keep her eyes closed. Shockingly, he then aimed the pellet gun at one of her closed eyes and pulled the trigger. Renee began to cry out from the pain and asked what he was doing. Edward assumed the pellet gun would be strong enough to kill her. He didn't want to use the pistol because he wasn't able to make a silencer for it, and thought that people would be able to hear the gunshots. Since the pellet gun didn't do the job, he ended up shooting her with the .22 pistol. However, that wound wasn't fatal either. According to autopsy reports, doctors removed 4 bullets and 2 pellets from her body. The variety of shots woke his sons, so he shot them both with the pistol as well. He then drove a short distance along the logging road. Edward would later recall that Renee stayed alive for about 45 minutes after he shot her, and she was in and out of consciousness. Renee would tell Edward that she loved him, and that Jesus loved him, and forgave him for what he had done. I could not imagine how she must have felt at that moment, to have the courage to say she still loves him after what he did to her, then to imagine what he was going to do to the rest of the family. He admitted that he was scared to shoot the pistol again, so he stabbed her in the lungs. He claimed he stabbed his daughter about 5 to 10 times, but the reports show that she was stabbed at least 18 times. Edward struggled to remove his wife's body from the minivan and stated he cut Renee's legs in an attempt to drain the blood and lessen the weight. He then moved the bodies of Renee, Bryant, and Jonathan to one side of the logging road, and Alexis's body to the opposite side, before driving back to Portland. Upon returning home, Edward collected a blonde rock star wig and other disguise elements he had purchased the day before. He then drove east on Interstate 84, carrying about $3,000 in cash. Near the Dalles, and feeling drowsy, he exited and checked into a motel late on the morning of December 20th, 2002. Edward avoided showing his driver's license or revealing his identity to the motel clerk, fearing that police might be tracking him. Instead, he came up with a cover story and said he lived in Anchorage, Alaska, and had lost his driver's license when he was robbed in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He then slept for several hours and upon waking up, continued driving east on Interstate 84. He drove constantly for much of the next day. He drove past Baker City, following Interstates 84 and 80 southeast through Idaho and into Utah, then continued on Interstate 15 to Las Vegas. He believed he had enough cash in order to start his new life as a hitman. He stated He was a very frugal person and planned to dress like a businessman so that he wouldn't seem suspicious. He also planned on buying a farm in order to have a place to bury the bodies of his future victims. During his confession, he told investigators he believed he could make as much as $3,000 on a successful day of murdering people. When speaking with Detective Kirch McCormick and Undersheriff Ken Drays, he said, quote, "I'm going to cost the state thousands of dollars. What's a couple of bucks for a map?" When they gave him a pen and atlas to outline his travels. He mentioned that he couldn't remember the name of a certain town that's near Las Vegas and starts with the letter P. Kirch once lived in Southern California and suggested that it might have been Pahrump, near the California border. It's about 40 miles west of Vegas. Edward immediately said, "Pahrump, that's it," as if he finally remembered the name of a song that was stuck in his head all day. He continued and said his first plan was to get a train ticket from Seattle to Las Vegas, then drive to Seattle and leave the family's minivan in the long-term parking lot at the Seattle-Tacoma airport. He wanted to throw off police into thinking whoever killed the family, including himself, took a flight to SeaTac after. He would then be able to go on his killing spree. He learned, however, that Amtrak doesn't stop in Las Vegas, so he came up with multiple scenarios. One of them included finding another minivan identical to the one that they had and switching the license plates, but he said he couldn't do it. Returning to Oregon wasn't something he thought about because he figured the police hadn't found the bodies yet. Edwards said none of his friends expected the family to return from the coast until December 20th because there was a dress rehearsal for a Christmas play at the family's church. Quote, "I probably ruined that play. My wife was co-director, and my kids were the stars, my two oldest kids." He goes on by saying he decided he was going to build a dirt house in the desert to live in and do most of his killing in the winter. According to him, killing in a warmer season would be problematic because concealing a weapon while wearing shorts isn't an easy task. Quote, "I've wanted to be a murderer since I was a kid." Before Edward left Nevada for Arizona, he saw a man sleeping in a Ford Explorer parked along a gravel road a couple hundred feet from a highway near Pahrump. He considered robbing and killing him, but ultimately decided not to. He made it to Arizona and then drove to Flagstaff. While continuing his story, he said, quote, "We went to Flagstaff," then chuckled, quote, "We. I'm getting to like you too much, Randy. I'm starting to include you in my trip." Randy Crutcher was the sergeant speaking to him during the recorded confession. Edward stopped at a church between Flagstaff and Phoenix. He told the pastor his real name and explained that he was writing a book and searching for a secluded property to rent. The pastor kindly allowed him to sleep in the church's fellowship hall. Quote, "He was a nice guy. I regret that I lied to him." Edward arrived in Phoenix, he believes, on December 23rd. At a Sears store, he purchased a welder and a drill press, tools necessary for building a silencer for his gun. He recalled wanting the 12-inch drill press, but it was too expensive at $194. So he opted for the 8-inch press at $94. However, he soon worried that the smaller press might not be adequate for making a functional silencer. He confided to Randy that he hoped the homemade device would malfunction and kill him. Quote, "I would be okay with that. It's what I deserved." Edward then digressed from his chronological account, sharing that he had spent hours trying to clean his wife's blood from between the minivan's front seats. Quote, "I did such a bad job of killing her, and she bled a lot. Eventually, he gave up, though he noted that the pre-moistened cloths he had, typically used for cleaning a baby, were surprisingly effective at removing blood splatter. Quote, "They're wonderful for things of that nature." That is such an odd and eerie thing to say, and it literally sends shivers down my spine. He then tells Randy about how he spent the next week or so in either Phoenix or the desert west of the city. Edward bought a power inverter. A power inverter converts DC power from a battery into standard AC power, allowing you to run various devices such as electric lights, kitchen appliances, microwaves, power tools, TVs, radios, and computers. However, it wouldn't run his welder, so he wasn't able to make progress on the silencer. When police found the silencer, it had a single hole drilled in it. Edward goes on about how he met a man that informed him about an abandoned building that was as large as an airplane hangar. Trying to find it, he spent about $150 worth of gas, but never did. Quote, "Imagine how many bodies and cars you could store in a hangar." Edward slept in his van, and in order to keep warm, he lit 3 candles. The candles weren't enough to keep him warm, so every 2 hours, he would start the van and run the heater. He ended up buying 2 more candles to add to his collection. He had 5 candles and stated they were only good for 4 hours if he didn't run the van's heater. On the night of January 1st, 2003, Edward recounts driving to Phoenix with the intention of beginning his murderous spree. Quote, "I planned to kill that night." Edward describes meeting a man named Sean, who, still slightly tipsy from New Year's celebrations, had veered off the road. Although he considered killing Sean, Edward decided instead to take him home. Edward then drove through a rough part of North Phoenix, characterized by a majority of bars and tattoo parlors compared to churches. He notes that the area was poorly lit. Quote, "Just the sort of target zone I was looking for." He tells Randy he initially thought he could kill a few people without even resorting to robbery, believing that the act of killing would become easier and easier. Quote, "But I couldn't even get out of the car. I was already realizing, oh no, there's no hope for me." The next day, January 2nd, Edward decided he couldn't go through with killing anyone else, and resolved to return to Oregon and turn himself in. However, he wanted to see the Grand Canyon first. Quote, "God gave me a beautiful family, and I destroyed it. I wanted to see something beautiful that I couldn't ruin." As Edward said this, he began crying, as he did multiple times throughout the confession. He told Randy he hiked for a couple of miles along the canyon's rim and watched the sun climb into the sky. Quote, "It was pretty, but I really needed to have my wife there. Renee and I had always wanted to go to the Grand Canyon, and I kept seeing all of these beautiful families." He then said he drove west to Utah, then north, in order to retrace his route along Interstates 15, 80, and 84 into Idaho. On the morning of January 4th, 2003, Edward stopped in Boise with the intention of buying gas and 100 feet of rope. He tells Randy that he planned to use the rope to transport his wife's body to his van. Edward also intended to retrieve his children's bodies and have them in the van when he turned himself into the police. However, the store in Boise only had 50-foot lengths of rope, prompting him to exit the freeway at Baker City. He hoped the Rite Aid there would have 100-foot ropes, but it did not. Before he could search elsewhere, 2 vigilant motorists, brother and sister, 50-year-old Tom and 58-year-old Linda Martin, spotted his minivan on Interstate 84, east of Baker City, by the license plate WSH 171. Linda specifically remembered the van because of the speed going about 55 miles per hour. She also stated that she had a habit of looking at license plates, which is oddly something that I do too. Quote, "I always look at license plates. The minute I saw the 171, I knew." The Martins first stopped at the Durkee gas station to report the situation to the police. They then returned to the freeway, drove past the gray minivan a second time, and headed to Baker City. They took the first exit and followed signs to the state police office on South Bridge Street, adjacent to Mount Hope Cemetery. Finding the office closed, the Martins used the emergency phone outside. Randy reported that their call was forwarded to the Oregon State Police Dispatch Center in Medford. After providing their information, the Martins decided to get back on the freeway and try to catch up with the gray minivan. However, being unfamiliar with the city's streets, they did not find their way back to the interstate, and instead ended up on East Campbell Street. As they drove east past the Subway sandwich shop, the Martins were astonished to see the same gray minivan pass them, heading west. They quickly made a U-turn and watched as the van pulled into the Rite Aid parking lot. The Martins then rushed to a payphone outside the Safeway store located next to Rite Aid and called the police once more. Police didn't want to directly confront Edward in the store because they were worried about the safety of the other shoppers. Oregon State Police troopers and Baker County Sheriff's deputies hid behind the counter of the store and waited for Edward to walk out. He walked out only 10 minutes later. Sergeant Doug Schrade and Detective John Shepard of the Baker City Police Department drew their guns on Edward and commanded him to the ground. Quote, "He simply complied. He dropped to his knees, laid down, and spread out. He was quite subdued," Doug said. Edward then asked, "Did you find my family?" And Doug told him that they did, and Edward sighed to show relief that they knew the truth. The brother and sister that called the police claimed the $50,000 reward that was offered by the FBI. Edward was placed in the back of a police cruiser and driven away for 4 hours of questioning with detectives. He was unarmed, had recently shaved his head, and was wearing wire-rimmed glasses, a mustache, a black trench coat, and a black golf hat. According to Doug, Edward didn't appear to be carrying any bags from the store. The manhunt had started the day after hunters discovered the body of Renee Morris, around 8:30 a.m. on December 21st in the Tillamook State Forest, approximately 30 miles east of Tillamook. Authorities then found the bodies of her children, Bryant, Alexis, and Jonathan, nearby. Renee Morris's mother, Pat Elmore, was at the Morris home on North Syracuse Street sorting through some of her daughter's belongings when a friend called her to inform her that the capture of Edward Morris had been reported on the news. Pat Elmore was soon joined by Renee's stepfather, Keith Elmore, and family friend Tom Stubblefield. Tom described the family's reaction as elated, noting their relief that Edward Morris, whom they feared might harm others, had been apprehended. Quote, "Their expressions changed from despair to relief," Tom said. Just 2 days prior to Morris's arrest, investigators had little information about his whereabouts. Quote, "He could be anywhere in the world," Charles Matthews, head of FBI operations in Oregon, remarked during a news conference. After receiving 615 tips, detectives established that Edward was at his North Portland home at 9:15 on December 19th, when he spoke on the phone with a friend. They also confirmed that Edward checked into a motel in the Dalles at 10:30 a.m. on December 20th. He paid in cash, registered under the name Jim Elliott, and did not provide identification. His van was last seen at the motel at 1 a.m., and by 6 a.m., when a clerk checked the parking lot, it was no longer there. Based on these sightings, investigators believe the murders occurred between 10:15 p.m. on December 19th and 8:30 a.m. on December 20th, near where the bodies were discovered off Drift Creek Road near Oregon 6. This timeline allowed Morris to travel from North Portland to the Coast Range and then from the Coast Range to the Dalles. Reports also came in of Edward being spotted in Olympia, Seattle, Bellingham, Washington, and British Columbia. However, he told detectives on Saturday that he never crossed the Oregon-Washington border. Sheriff Todd confirmed that he did leave the state but did not provide further details. Quote, "This is a prime example of the public working with law enforcement," said Tillamook County Sheriff Todd Anderson during a news conference that Saturday night. Randy said, quote, "Edward is a man who, if you ran into him on the street and talked to him, I don't think you'd have a clue that, one, he did this, killed his family, and two, that he was capable of doing it." During the confession, Edward admitted that he planned on killing his family. Edward also mentioned that the main issue was money. Quote, "I haven't been a very good provider lately. I felt like half of a person, miserable and terrified. Over the last 6 months before killing his family, he had spent over $40,000, and he stated that he wanted to give more to his wife, whom he described as beautiful. Quote, "I knew she was worthy of so much more than I had provided. All my life I wanted to be a hitman for the mob. I even tried to kill people in Portland before I killed my family." It's important to note that family annihilators often murder their families due to a loss of control, including financial crises. That is the first thing that stood out to me when I read through his confession. Another thing I would like to note is that when I cover these cases, I typically talk about the murderer's childhood. However, there was no information about Edward's childhood online. Based off of the fact that during his confession he stated he had wanted to be a murderer since he was a child, we can infer that either he came from a violent household or he's just had these violent tendencies built up in his mind since a child. On December 23rd, the Tillamook County District Attorney charged Edward with 7 counts of aggravated murder. Additionally, the FBI issued a federal arrest warrant for Edward, charging him with unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. As Edward concludes his story, Randy expresses his appreciation for Edward's honesty. Quote, "I can't tell you, Edward, how much I appreciate your candor." Randy then asks if any police officials made promises to elicit his confession. Quote, "Just so that I could finish my sandwich and use the bathroom," Edward replied. However, Randy's involvement in the Edward case continued beyond the tape. A few days later, he flew to Tillamook to testify before the grand jury that convicted Edward for the murders. Nearly 2 years later, Randy, who has interviewed many murderers in his career, describes Edward as one of the most mysterious killers he has ever encountered. Edward spoke about the bodies of his wife and children in a detached, almost clinical manner, as if he were a medical examiner examining strangers. Yet at other moments during the interview, Edward broke down in tears while speaking about his wife, whom he described as beautiful, and his wonderful children. Quote, "He does show appropriate emotion, and I think he was really remorseful. He cries because I think he feels genuine sorrow that he's done this." Randy also believes that Edward's religious convictions, such as his belief that his wife and children are in a better place, are genuine. Regardless of this feeling, however, Randy said Edward is guilty, and that police always focus on the people closest to home, such as the husband in this type of case. This is 100% how investigators think, and why so many people use the phrase, "the husband did it." Randy noted that the basic facts of the Morris case pointed to the husband, the only member of the Morris family unaccounted for, as the primary suspect. He found it inconceivable that someone could abduct an entire family, murder the pregnant wife and 3 children, and then either escape with the husband still alive or kill him as well as dispose of his body elsewhere. Quote, "There was no question in my mind, just as the case unfolded, that this guy had done it." Randy then recalled Edward asking him to help him get the death penalty. Randy also said he believes that seems to be the proper punishment in this case. William Porter, the Tillamook County District Attorney, considered taking the case to trial and pursuing the death penalty instead of agreeing to a plea deal with Edward in September of 2004. However, he was concerned that although doctors had determined Edward was mentally competent to stand trial, his peculiar behavior might lead a jury to favor a life sentence over the death penalty. William never questioned Edward's sanity, only his guilt. Quote, "He's a very, very strange guy, but he clearly knew what he was doing was wrong. That's why he ran." 2 additional factors influenced William's decision not to seek the death penalty. First, he noted that out of the 58 convicted murderers sentenced to Oregon's death row since 1984, only 2 had been executed, while 27 had their sentences commuted to life in prison. Second, William spoke with Renee Morris's parents, who sought finality in this case, something unattainable in a death penalty case due to years of mandatory appeals. Quote, "Their wishes were something I certainly considered. This seemed like the best decision for this case." When Randy said goodbye to Edward on January 4th, 2003, he felt he had done a challenging job well. However, he found no comfort in his success. Quote, "The core of the Edward Morris case is not about arrests and confessions and convictions, but about the death of a family. It was just a terrible tragedy." Edward was charged with 7 counts of aggravated murder, as Oregon law counts the murder of a child under 14 years old as 2 separate offenses. On September 20th, 2004, Edward pleaded guilty to all 7 counts of aggravated murder and was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms in prison. My heart goes out to the family. To have your entire family and life taken away from you is so unfair, and I hope that Renee and her family have felt that they got some sense of justice. As always, all evidence will be linked in the show notes as well as on our Instagram at Murder Tapes Podcast. Feel free to follow my personal as well at Annalisa. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you on the next one.